When we were first deciding what topic to use for our research project, we began throwing out ideas, and the one that seemed to grab our attention the most right away was ability grouping and tracking within schools, attempting to focus on reading groups. The majority of the group has had some experience either observing ability grouping or using it to some extent in the classroom. For example, in the school where I had taught previously, guidance actually tried to group students in English and math classes based on their state test scores and subjects. Unfortunately, due to scheduling conflicts, if a student received a low score in English and was placed in a double-blocked class 5 days a week for remedial attention in that area, oftentimes they were double-blocked in math because of scheduling. So the problem then occurs when a student who gets a high score in math ends up in a double-blocked remedial class due to their low score in English, or vice versa. And when you place a student with a high achievement score in math in a remedial math class, they're going to get bored. And you could very well cause the student to lose motivation, which can also lead to discipline issues. This is just one personal experience with ability grouping. I believe most of the interest in the subject related to personal experiences with ability grouping and wanting to see what research has found on the subject.
When we began to search for articles, group members typically used ERIC or JSTOR databases on the Millersville Library site or Google Scholar to locate articles. Something that the group found helpful while trying to search for different sources on our topic were the Module 3 videos. These tutorials really enhanced our ability to find primary and secondary sources while also limiting our searches to look for more narrow views on the topic. We had little to no issue finding articles to use for the research paper, but the challenge was in obtaining articles that focused on reading and ability grouping as a specific topic. When evaluating the articles we found as a group, we met via Google Hangouts and shared links to the articles and summaries. If the article sounded good, we would scan the article as a group and decide if the research was appropriate for our topic. This process was extremely beneficial because we were able to gain perspective from the entire group. For example, if I found an article and I thought it could be used in the paper, we would evaluate it as a group, and then someone might say, well, this doesn't have enough detail, or this is a mixed methodology and we need more qualitative. I found that the input of my group was invaluable during the process of choosing articles to use for the final paper. I think at times we all struggled with parts of the research process, and I think we were able to learn a lot from each other. What we found in comparing our research is that there's a lot of conflicting information. This wasn't very surprising because the topic is so polarizing. One of the most surprising discrepancies was that many of our secondary sources claimed that tracking would be most damaging socially and emotionally to the lower achieving students, but the primary research on that specific topic doesn't necessarily bear that out. Actually, it showed that students tend to compare themselves with students in the same class or track, not to students in a track above or below them. In the Yasunawa study, the issues raised by students about lower track classes did not reflect superiority over their fellow classmates, but rather a concern that the lower level students should receive a strong education as well. Considerable research was dedicated to the study of how students are placed in these tracks. This seems to be a major sticking point with detracking proponents, as they claim that race, socioeconomic status, and behavior factor much too heavily into the tracking process. Primary research has confirmed this, with the Katsambas studies confirming that this is still a case in some areas as recently as 2012. Overall, we noted that the research often focused on the equality of selection and resource distribution more heavily than it did on actual cognitive or academic growth. Moreover, the secondary sources serve as a good discussion of relevant articles on the topic, but primary sources deserve more merit for consideration, and this is because there's so much primary research available that proponents of either side have a wealth of information to choose from, making articles strictly advocating one side or the other seem extremely flat in the context of the entire conversation. An interesting path for future secondary articles might be to consider primary sources from both sides and then provide examples of the best situations for tracking or detracking, rather than simply just a discussion of whether tracking in and of itself is a good or bad thing to do.
For the primary sources, we found that data collection was a relative strong point in the body of our research. First, it was extremely rare for a study to rely on only one data point alone. In fact, only one of our studies relied solely on participant performance on standardized tests. In most cases, a combination of interviews, surveys, questionnaires, teacher evaluations, recorded field observations, and standardized tests were used in making any sort of conclusions about tracking. A particular strength with the qualitative research data was that actual quotations taken from the transcripts were actually included to support researcher claims. Again, the general weakness in data collection came with the lack of information regarding the description of the methods and measures used. A few studies failed to explain the questionnaire, interview, and survey questions, making analysis difficult.
Overall, our group researched and summarized secondary articles that reflected a majority opinion. As a group, we analyzed the articles with the question of whether academic tracking is good for all students. The primary conclusion is that tracking is beneficial for high-achieving students, but the struggling student will not receive the same benefit. The general consensus among the education researcher is students benefit from a mixed ability classroom, yet the researchers cannot agree on the type of studies and the results that come from the studies. Several researchers sought to discredit an already published tracking studies. Many of the well-known researchers in education back ability grouping, but they resort to using IQ scores and the socioeconomic status of the students. Several of the articles made the determination that there is no set standard for ability grouping, and often the teachers make the determination by concentrating on their particular focus area. So a strong argument can be made that this practice is unfair. Another issue with grouping is it often is difficult to move out of the low achieving group. The studies agree that a disproportionate number of students are minority and come from a low socioeconomic background. Many minority students have already made up their minds concerning their future educations and career goals by third grade. By placing them in a low achieving group, the students lower their expectations. Our group found that there's a strong bias among the articles, which results from the author's particular area of focus. The articles do agree in some points, but with other points there is a true binary. Articles targeted an audience of educators and policymakers, and the authors seem to have a personal agenda for writing the papers.
As a group, we found tons of primary research done on this topic, as it has been quite controversial in the world of education for a long time. While there are several themes that emerged from the research, we found a few to be more prevalent with the sources that we selected. First, we found that there is a good bit of our research centering teacher and student preference when it comes to tracking and ability grouping. As you can imagine, we found mixed results throughout. Interestingly, though, the studies that surveyed older students' preferences came out against tracking, citing lower teacher and resource quality as their reason for distaste. Then when younger elementary students were surveyed, especially those with learning disabilities, they preferred homogeneous grouping, citing fear of ridicule and self-esteem issues as their reason. We were intrigued by this, as all the studies seem to point to the fact that lower ability students actually suffer academically from tracking and ability grouping, while higher achieving students maybe only slightly benefit from tracking and ability grouping. As a whole, in both our secondary and primary research, the idea that teachers favored tracking was quite supported with what we found. Differentiated curriculum, customized pacing, and greater time spent with students one-on-one were some of the reasons that teachers preferred tracking. I mentioned earlier some of the strengths to the qualitative research that we found. One of the difficulties that we found with a lot of the quantitative research, especially large-scale quantitative research, was the lack of uniformity in the process of tracking. Every school represents an extremely unique environment when it comes to tracking and ability grouping practices. One must consider how students are grouped, who decides on the groups, and if students are able to move between the groups. Some schools practice between class grouping, known as tracking, while other schools only use within class grouping, known as ability grouping. And some use a combination of the two. Keeping this in mind, it would be almost impossible to conduct a large-scale research study where all the aforementioned variables were identical, because schools, administrators, teachers, parents, guidance counselors, and sometimes even students have a unique role in how tracking practices occur in each specific school environment.